Right, we want now to drill deeper to more on climate change talk, and I'm joined by Nickson Otieno, who is an environmental expert, to tell us more about the COP26. They came up with the first draft, as it were, right now, and as curtains closed on climate change summit COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, this past weekend, it is curious that the discourse on this issue of global importance is yet to gain traction in Kenya, even during a busy campaigning period. We are yet to hear any politician bring up the issue of climate change or even conservation of the environment. In fact, the biggest discussion in as far as climate change summit is concerned is conserved, or Kenya is conserved, and was the size of Kenya's delegation to the conference. And we want to take this matter seriously and discuss with Nickson. Nickson, over to you. First of all, I want just to thank you for joining us this morning here on News Center. And I'll begin by asking you, first of all, what was your overview of the entire conference in Glasgow before we drill deeper?
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, the conference was important for not only the global community, but also us as a nation, and even the local communities, because it brought over 200 world leaders together to discuss and prioritize the agenda of climate change and to come up with actions and commitments that can ensure that we arrest the issue of climate change, to ensure that we don't really expose our communities and people to the adverse effects. So this is a very relevant summit, and especially to shift the political commitment and focus towards this issue, which is an existential threat to our communities and the people who are mostly vulnerable. Thank you.
Right, and it brings to question the fact that we have also parties within this particular country that they're gravitating towards environmental social governance. I'm aware of Green Party, even as we're talking about the general election in 2022. People also are running with the idea that, yes, it's a reality check that climate change is here with us, global warming is here with us. But how do we then, you as an environmental expert, how then do we make sure that these parties, they are particularly intent on climate change as an action point?
Yeah, thank you very much. There are two ways of looking at that issue of aligning the political parties' manifesto with the climate change and the larger environmental conservation agenda. First, of course, you mentioned the Green Party that that is really encouraged, that we have a party that is exclusively committed to the conservation agenda as a key topic, as a key philosophy in their political governance structure. But I have to say that, of course, you are aware that this Green Party still does not have necessarily the significant following, political following that it needs to be able to galvanize a critical mass of people and citizenry to support the environmental agenda. So that brings us to the second issue, that we really don't need to think of climate change and environmental agenda as an issue that is championed by a particular party. Rather, the climate change and environment agenda should be mainstreamed into all facets of the society. So all political parties, and especially the major political parties we have in this country, really need to mainstream this issue into their manifestation, into their manifesto. And not only as a climate change and environment agenda, but also to look at the possibilities of mainstreaming the issue in different sectors. For example, if they're looking at their agriculture priorities, then we need to look at how to be able to look at our agricultural sector being protected from the vulgarities of weather, changing weather and the climate, to ensure that we're able to guarantee our farmers, we're able to, productivity even in the light of the changing climate, to ensure that the construction sector or the manufacturing sector or all other sectors have the mechanisms to integrate environmental conservation and climate change mitigation and adaptation actions in the items. So this is a very important issue that we need to actually empower the parties not only to be dedicated to an environmental or climate change agenda, but to mainstream, looking at the sectors critically. That is my point of view as far as environmental governance is concerned.
Yes, thank you. And of course, I know by now you're privy to the COP26 draft agreement that had some very seminal points and was addressed at the conference of parties, as it were. We'll drill deeper into that momentarily. But I think also for Africa and Kenya, for that matter, was a big win that we had some funding coming from the World Bank, close to $150 billion, that this will, 150 billion shillings, I should say, that will go to the counties. And we know that with the advent of the Climate Change Act 2016, it recognizes the subnational county government as key implementers when it comes to climate change actions, as it were. Tell us more about this particular fund. And I spoke to His Excellency Dr. Wilbur Otichilo, who is the governor of Vihiga, and also he happens to be the chair of Environment and Climate Change Committee at the Council of Governors. We know there will be a big conference of the devolution conference, which is coming up very soon, I think next week. And they will be also focusing on climate change as a theme.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, as you rightfully said, climate finance was a major issue of discussion at the COP26 conference in Glasgow. And this particularly is premised on the fact that most of the nations which the Conference of Parties called parties, so the parties in the UNFCCC climate change agenda are called parties, recognize that many of the countries that are adversely affected by climate change, who are bearing the greater impact of climate change, are often the least contributors in terms of the greenhouse gases that exacerbate climate change. But also they are under-resourced in terms of their capacities to be able to put in measures to protect their populations, to help their populations who are vulnerable adapt. So it is in that context that climate finance was looked at as a very important agenda, that we have to ensure that we create equity in the environmental climate change agenda, that such that the nations, the developed nations that are polluting most, who are contributing a lot to the increasing greenhouse gases and the changing climate significantly, also contribute financial resources to support the nations and the communities that are most vulnerable, but also contributing little to be able to take up actions to help them adapt and build their resilience towards climate change. And it is in that context that, as you have mentioned, a lot of commitments were being pushed, and World Bank, you have given an example, that the developed nations are committed themselves to really ensure that every year that they commit at least $100 billion US flowing to the developing nations to help them implement climate change adaptation and mitigation measures. And of course, that World Bank financing is welcome, but also, as you rightfully mentioned it, as a country also, we have one of the very progressive climate change laws in the world. We have the Climate Change Act of 2016, which in itself provides a mechanism for climate change funding. So we have the Climate Change Fund that is not only at the national level, but also the counties are empowered to come up with their mechanisms. And we have some of the counties, for example, the Vihiga County, which is headed by the governor, Otichilo, whom you mentioned. We have Makueni County that have already enacted their climate change acts, and they're already creating climate change funds, so that part of the funding that the county is receiving, they have dedicated finance to support climate change actions at the local level. At the national level also, I'm aware the Treasury has been doing a lot of work to be able to track, provide instruments for tracking all the resources that are coming into the county, and look at how are these funds aligned to help address the climate change agenda. So you would understand that, for example, in the last year, this the country Kenya received about $2.5 billion in terms of climate change finance flows, either coming from the development partners or are coming from the private sector. Of course, the private sector contribution was still insignificant, with about only less than 25% coming from the private sector. So we need to look at not only the funds that are coming from the development partner, the international community, out of that pocket of $100 billion that have been committed by nations out of the COP26 conference. But also we need to look at ourselves locally. How do we spend our budget? You know, the money that comes from the exchequer, the money that we commit from the revenues that we collect at the national level. Are we investing them into those priority programs that will help cushion our communities, our vulnerable populations, from the adverse impact of climate change? So that is really where the counties become really important. We do need not only to talk about the 35% of the budget that we have nationally being pushed to the county, But even that 35%, we should ensure that is prudently spent to ensure that our communities that are vulnerable are protected from the effects of climate change. So again, I would emphasize the agenda of a mainstreaming, that we don't need only to look at dedicated climate fund, but we also need to look at the mechanisms of integrating climate change into the stream of funding. I give you an example. Most of us are currently inconvenienced by the road works that is ongoing. Infrastructure is a major project that we are undertaking as a country. We need to ensure that out of those billions that are spent also in the infrastructure, we include climate change component into it. For example, we would look at our road infrastructure that we are building to ensure that they are built to be resilient to the impact of climate change. For example, recently we had a case where part of the road, like Suswa, if you're traveling through to Narok, that was cut off at a certain time by the floods. So we need to ensure that even the infrastructure funding that are going into these major projects should provide mechanisms to ensure that those infrastructure we are building are designed, are constructed to ensure that they are able to withstand the most extreme weather events that we may foresee in the near future, so that we don't put 10 billion into an infrastructure that in the next 10 or 20 years would be swept off by floods or would be really swept off by other extreme climate events. Thank you.
Right. Nickson, maybe just to be educated by you, the fact that we had the Climate Change Act 2016 that also brought to office the National Climate Directorate, I wonder what is the role of this particular directorate in line of what we're talking about when we have the implementation of these policies that we are looking forward to how the 47 counties also have their own climate change policies and the implementation of it. What is the role of the directorate?
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, the Climate Change Act established the directorate as one of the key governance institutions that are pivotal in driving the agenda of the climate change. Of course, you also have the other institutions like the Climate Change Council, which is chaired by the president himself. So the role of the directorate, if I may not really quote directly, but I would just give an overview, is to be able to coordinate the climate change actions across the sectors. You understand that climate change and environment agenda is a cross-cutting issue. It is not purely an issue of the Ministry of Environment or just the environment sector. As I mentioned, for example, you look at agriculture, and just before we came on air on this show, you are featuring the impact of climate change on agriculture. We are looking at other sectors like the tourism industry. We have basically all sectors of the economy that are affected by climate change and need to take action. So the role of the Climate Change Directorate is to provide a coordination mechanism to bring all these key sectors together to ensure that they are able to make commitments that are aligned with the national commitment that the government of Kenya has made. We have commitments that are outlined in the Act. We have commitments that are aligned in the other plans. For example, what we call the National Adaptation Plan. We have the Climate Change Action Plan that are committing the country to take certain actions to ensure that we reduce the emissions that we are generating and ensure that we protect our communities from the effects of climate change. So the role of the directorate is to ensure that all these different sectors come up with actions that would help them address it will help the country address the climate change agenda. And I would give examples of some of the actions that the directorate has undertaken in the past. For example, I talked about the climate funding. So what the directorate was able to do through mobilizing resources from the international community like UNDP, the directorate was implementing a project called LECRE that helped to come up with mechanisms to help the counties and the national government be able to track and monitor climate finance. So the Treasury has developed tools to be able to code climate change funding in the budget and be able to track it and monitor so that you have an accountability mechanism. Number two, the directorate also has supported a mechanism to develop reporting and verification tools so that even as we go back to the conference of parties, or when we go to the conference like we had in Glasgow recently, the country can be able to have very clearly well-set science-based targets of our emissions so that they are not really just figures we are quoting from nowhere. They are informed by real data. And we are also be able to track them and be able to say that this is the extent to which we are developing in terms of the climate change actions. Number three, the directorate is also responsible to support education. Many people, the citizenry, the different sector needs to be aware of the issue. Their capacity need to be strengthened so that they know how they can take action in their different sectors to be able to contribute to the climate change action. So, for example, the Directorate over the past 2 years, towards late of this year, came up with a climate change learning action and strategy. And the purpose of this strategy is to ensure that the climate change agenda and environmental agenda is mainstream into all levels of learning, both formal and informal, and starting even from the lowest level as low as the primary school level, so that our young people know what the climate change issue is and the actions that they need to take. The different sectors also know what their role could be in addressing the climate change agenda. And there are many other issues that we could highlight, but in the interest of time, I could just flag out some of those as the key actions that the Directorate is supposed to help us address. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Nickson. We want just to take a short break right now and of course, run the commercials. Then we circle back. We continue with you, Nickson. I think you have a rich repository of your knowledge to teach us on climate change and the way forward, as it were. When we circle back, Nickson, maybe this is what you should be also marinating on, because everywhere, even from the corporates, the entire world now is focusing on environmental, social, and governance. And we're talking about corporate governance. We're talking about the integrated reporting that even financially we can see they're calling for, corporates to have in their balance sheet accounting on how they're actually also conserving the environment. As much as they're extracting, how much are they giving as well? We'll take a short break right now. Don't go away.